The rain fell hard over Maple Hollow that night, painting silver rivers on every window. Somewhere out there, Officer Ethan Cole sat in his patrol car, the radio humming softly, unaware that his phone kept flashing. His little girl was calling again and again. At home, 10-year-old Ellie knelt on the cold kitchen floor, tiny hands trembling as she picked up shards of broken plates. Her stepmother's voice echoed behind her, sharp and cruel, but Ellie said nothing. She just held her baby brother close and looked out into the rain, whispering a single wish. "Please, Daddy, come home." Sometimes the calls we ignore are the ones that change everything. Where are you watching from tonight? Drop your city in the comments, and may your day be filled with peace and love. The rain had been falling since dawn, a steady, endless rhythm against the rooftops of Maple Hollow, a quiet Oregon town tucked between pines and mist. The streets gleamed like dark glass beneath the weak yellow of the streetlights. Down by the old police station, a row of patrol cars glistened under the drizzle, their red and blue lights faintly pulsing through the fog. It was the kind of night when everything looked blurred, as if the world had forgotten its sharp edges. Inside the station, Officer Ethan Cole sat at his desk, a half-empty cup of coffee cooling beside a stack of unfinished reports. He was 39, broad-shouldered, with a quiet strength that came less from muscle and more from endurance. His hair, dark brown streaked with the first hints of gray, was still damp from the rain. The scar across his right hand, thin and pale like a white thread, was the only visible trace of the explosion that had almost cost him his life years ago. Those who knew Ethan described him as steady, reliable, and sometimes too composed for his own good. But behind that composure lived a fatigue he never spoke of, the kind that came from losing things without making a sound. His wife had passed 5 years earlier in a car accident on the icy stretch outside town. Since then, Ethan had built his life around his children, his work, and his partner in silence, a German shepherd named Rex. Rex lay curled on the rug near Ethan's boots, his black and tan fur glistening faintly under the flickering fluorescent light. He was 6 years old now, strong but slightly limping from an old wound on his left hind leg, a wound he had earned saving Ethan during a warehouse raid. Since his injury, Rex had retired from the K-9 unit, but he still followed Ethan everywhere, as if duty had simply changed form. His amber eyes never left the man's face, alert yet gentle, always listening. To others, Rex was just a dog. To Ethan, he was the one creature who had seen every version of him, officer, widower, father, and man holding himself together. The station phone rang once, then stopped. Ethan rubbed his eyes, thinking of home. His shift was nearly over, but the report on his screen blinked unfinished. He told himself he'd leave after this one last paragraph. The clock read 8:47 p.m. His phone, forgotten on the table, buzzed softly, a small, persistent vibration against metal. Ellie, it flashed on the screen. 10 years old, with chestnut hair and wide hazel eyes that mirrored her late mother's. She called him every night after dinner to tell him about school or her drawings or their neighbor's cat stealing cookies again. But tonight, he didn't answer. The call stopped, then started again. He sighed, half smiling. "You little chatterbox," he muttered, and silenced the phone. Miles away at the edge of Maple Hollow, rain drummed harder against the windows of a modest 2-story house on Havenbrook Street. Inside, the kitchen smelled faintly of burnt soup and lemon cleaner. A small girl stood barefoot on the tiled floor, a broom in her shaking hands. Ellie Cole was small for her age, pale from too many skipped meals, her school uniform damp from earlier chores. Her hair, brown and soft as fallen leaves, clung to her cheeks. She had inherited her mother's gentle eyes, the kind that could make even silence seem kind, but lately, those eyes had lost their light. At the sink stood Vanessa, Ethan's second wife. She was in her mid-30s, tall and slender, her blonde hair pulled into a severe bun that made her cheekbones look sharper. To strangers, Vanessa looked like elegance itself, always neatly dressed, her voice low and controlled, every movement deliberate. But there was something brittle about her calmness, like porcelain stretched too thin. She had once worked as an event planner in Portland before moving to Maple Hollow after meeting Ethan at a charity gala. To everyone, she seemed compassionate, a widow comforting a widower. But those who lived under her roof saw another side, perfectionism turned cruel, control disguised as care. When the bowl slipped from Ellie's hands and shattered on the floor, Vanessa didn't flinch. She turned slowly, her expression unreadable, and said, "You made the mess, you clean it. Learn to take responsibility, sweetheart." Her tone was honeyed, but her eyes were cold. Ellie nodded quickly, biting her lip, and bent to gather the shards. Her little brother, Noah, only 4, stood by the doorway rubbing his eyes. "Ellie, hungry," he whispered, his voice thin and hoarse. Vanessa sighed, her irritation barely masked. "He can wait," she said sharply. "Dinner's a privilege, not a right." She turned back to her spotless counter, her phone glowing beside a half-finished glass of wine. Ellie's hands trembled as she swept the broken pieces into a dustpan. Blood welled from a small cut on her palm, red beads against porcelain white. She didn't cry. She had learned long ago that crying only made Vanessa colder. When she finished, she whispered, "Can I go inside now?" Vanessa didn't look up. "When the floor is spotless, you may come in. Otherwise, forget about dinner." Ellie swallowed hard and nodded. The wind outside howled, rattling the old window panes. She took a deep breath, then reached for the broom again. In the backyard, Rex stirred. He had been lying under the porch, his nose twitching at the scent of rain and fear. He stood, ears perked, and let out a low whine. His paws left muddy prints on the wet steps as he approached the back door, pressing his snout against the glass. Inside, Ellie heard the soft thump and turned. When their eyes met through the pane, hers wide, his bright, she felt something unexplainable. Safety. "Go away, Rex!" Vanessa called sharply without turning. "You're making the floor dirty." The dog didn't move. He stayed there, watching Ellie, his breath fogging the glass. Ellie smiled faintly, then whispered, "It's okay, boy. I'm fine." But even she didn't believe it. At the station, Ethan finally leaned back, stretching his sore shoulders. He reached for his phone and frowned at the screen. 5 missed calls. A twinge of guilt brushed through him. He was about to call back when the captain stepped out of his office. "Cole, got a minute?" Ethan sighed and tucked the phone into his jacket. "Sure thing." By the time he left the station, it was past 9:30. The rain had thickened into sheets. He drove through the empty streets, wipers fighting against the storm. When he turned onto Havenbrook Street, he noticed the house lights still on, and the gate slightly ajar. His gut tightened. As he stepped out of the car, the cold bit through his uniform. The smell of wet earth and pine filled the air. Then he saw it, a small figure crouched in the yard, hands raw, hair plastered to her forehead. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. "Ellie?" The girl froze. Slowly she turned, eyes wide under the porch light. "Dad?" Her voice cracked between fear and relief. Ethan crossed the yard in 3 strides, his boots splashing through puddles. He knelt, gathering her into his arms. She was cold, so cold he could feel the tremors through her soaked shirt. On her back, little Noah slept, his tiny arms limp around her neck. "Jesus, what happened?" Ethan whispered, glancing toward the doorway. Vanessa appeared there, framed by the warm kitchen light. She held a towel in one hand, her expression perfectly calm. "You're home early," she said smoothly. "She broke a bowl. I told her to clean it. That's all." Ethan's jaw tightened. "You made her do this outside? In the rain?" Vanessa raised an eyebrow. "Don't make it dramatic, Ethan. She needs to learn consequences." Rex growled low, stepping between them. His fur bristled, amber eyes fixed on Vanessa. For the first time, her composure wavered. "Control your dog," she snapped. Ethan stood, holding Ellie close. "No," he said quietly. "He's the only one who knows who needs protecting tonight." He carried Ellie inside, ignoring Vanessa's protests. He sat her by the fire, wrapped her in a blanket, and pressed a kiss to her damp forehead. "It's okay now, sweetheart," he murmured. "Dad's here." Ellie didn't speak. She only nodded, her lashes heavy with tears and rain. Rex lay down beside her, resting his head on her knee. The room filled with the faint crackle of firewood and the sound of Ethan's unsteady breathing. Behind them, Vanessa stood in silence, her perfect smile returning, thin and brittle as glass. "You're spoiling her," she said. Ethan didn't answer. He simply looked at his daughter, then at the dog lying protectively at her feet, and realized for the first time that silence could be crueler than any word. Outside, the rain kept falling, whispering against the roof as if the heavens themselves were trying to wash something clean. And in that quiet moment, Ethan Cole knew something inside his life had just cracked open, and it would never close again. Morning came to Maple Hollow, wrapped in gray clouds and silence. The rain had slowed, but never truly stopped. It whispered against the windows of the Cole house like an unfinished apology. Ethan stood at the kitchen counter, pouring coffee into a chipped mug, staring blankly at the dark surface. Behind him, the faint sound of small footsteps echoed. Ellie's. She moved carefully, as though afraid each sound might break something invisible in the air. Her hair, still damp from last night's storm, was tied back messily, revealing a faint bruise on her elbow. Ethan's chest tightened at the sight. Across the room, Rex lifted his head from his spot near the fireplace, his amber eyes following the girl's every step. His fur was still wet in patches, his ears twitching at the smallest sound. When Ellie quietly reached for a plate, Rex stood and patted closer, sniffing her hand before sitting down beside her feet. It was his way of saying, "I'm here." Vanessa entered moments later, immaculate as always, her blonde hair perfectly brushed, a white blouse tucked into a navy pencil skirt. Her beauty was deliberate, cold, like glass that only reflected light, never warmth. She walked past Ethan without a glance, opened the refrigerator, and said, "I hope you're planning to fix the fence today. The wind nearly tore it off last night." Her tone was casual, but each word landed sharp. Ethan didn't reply. He just nodded, his jaw tight. Ellie stood frozen near the counter, clutching a half-eaten piece of toast. Vanessa's eyes flicked toward her. "And you, young lady," she said, her voice suddenly turning sweet. "Did you learn your lesson about being careful?" Ellie's shoulders tensed. "Yes, ma'am," she murmured. "Good," Vanessa said, smiling faintly. "We can't have more broken dishes, can we?" Rex growled softly under his breath. It was quiet, barely audible, but enough for Ethan to shoot him a warning glance. Vanessa noticed too, narrowing her eyes. "You should have that dog trained better," she said. "He's too protective for his own good." Ethan set down his cup. "He's fine," he said simply. Breakfast ended in uneasy silence. When Ellie left for school, Ethan drove her himself, something he hadn't done in months. The air between them was fragile, filled with unspoken things. She sat in the back seat, clutching her backpack to her chest, eyes fixed on the window. "You okay, Pumpkin?" Ethan asked gently. She nodded but didn't turn around. "Dad," she said after a long pause, "if someone's mean but smiles when other people are around, does that still make them good?" Ethan glanced at her in the rearview mirror. Her small reflection looked older than her years. "It means they're trying to look good," he said softly, "but that doesn't make what they do right." Ellie didn't respond. She just looked down at her shoes and whispered, "I thought so." At school, the teacher waiting by the gate was Mrs. Catherine Bloom, a woman in her 50s with short silver hair and warm eyes framed by round glasses. She was known in town as the teacher who remembered every child's birthday. When she saw Ethan escorting Ellie, surprise flickered across her face. "Officer Cole," she greeted kindly. "It's good to see you. Everything all right?" Her tone carried both politeness and quiet concern. Ethan forced a small smile. "Just wanted to drop her off myself today." Mrs. Bloom's gaze lingered on Ellie, who stood half hidden behind her father's arm. "She's a bright girl," the teacher said softly. "Just quieter than she used to be." Ethan nodded, his throat tight. "I know, I'll work on that." Back home, Vanessa had already left for her volunteer shift at the community library, a place where she played the part of the charming stepmother, adored by neighbors who never saw the cracks. The house felt too large in her absence, filled with echoes of last night. Ethan sat at the table, turning his wedding ring absently. It had belonged to his late wife Laura, a woman with gentle laughter and the kind of patience that made time itself slow. Losing her had changed him, hardening the edges that love once softened. For years, he'd told himself that marrying Vanessa had been a way to give his children stability. Now, he wondered if it had only built a quieter kind of chaos. Rex nudged his hand, breaking his thoughts. The dog dropped a chewed tennis ball by Ethan's boots, a relic from the old K-9 training days. Ethan smiled weakly and threw it across the yard. Rex ran after it with surprising grace for his injured leg, returning moments later, panting softly, tail wagging. It was such a simple act, yet it filled the silence with something almost human. Later that afternoon, rain returned in short bursts. Ethan picked up Ellie from school, stopping by Martha Green's bakery on the way home. Martha was a stout woman in her 60s with a laugh that could fill a room. Her bakery, maple crust, smelled of cinnamon and honey. She had known Ethan since he was a rookie. When he walked in with Ellie, her eyes widened. "Well, I'll be," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Look who's finally taken a day off." Her tone was teasing but kind. She bent to smile at Ellie. "And this must be Miss Sunshine. Haven't seen you in a while." Ellie hesitated, then managed a small smile. "Hi, Miss Martha." Martha handed her a warm croissant. "On the house. You look like you could use something sweet." Back in the car, Ellie ate quietly, crumbs falling on her lap. "She's nice," she said softly. Ethan glanced at her. "Yeah. She's known me since before you were born. Used to babysit Rex when he was a puppy." Ellie smiled faintly, looking out at the rain-smeared town. For the first time in days, her voice held a trace of warmth. "Maybe we can visit. Again." Ethan's chest loosened. "I'd like that." When they reached home, Vanessa's car was already in the driveway. Inside, the smell of her expensive perfume mixed with the faint scent of bleach. She stood by the sink, sorting bills. Her voice was cool when she said, "You were gone long." Ethan shrugged, picked up Ellie, stopped for a snack. Vanessa's eyes flicked toward the croissant bag in Ellie's hands. "So she learns that rules don't matter if she smiles sweetly enough?" Ethan's temper sparked. "She's a kid, Vanessa. She's allowed to smile." Vanessa stared at him for a long moment, her face perfectly still. Then she turned away. "You always were too soft," she murmured. That night, as the house settled into silence, Ethan checked on Ellie. She was already asleep, curled beneath a blanket, Rex lying at the foot of her bed like a guardian carved from shadow. The rain outside had turned gentle, tapping the window pane in steady rhythm. Ethan sat on the edge of the bed, brushing a damp strand of hair from her cheek. Her breathing was slow, peaceful, but her hand still clenched the hem of her blanket as if afraid it might be taken away. Downstairs, Vanessa stood by the window, watching the rain. Her reflection in the glass looked tired, older. Once, years ago, she had been different. Or so she believed. Her childhood had been ruled by a mother who demanded perfection and punished anything less. "Clean until it shines," the woman used to say. Maybe that was why Vanessa saw mistakes as personal betrayals. Maybe that was why she couldn't bear Ellie's softness, because it reminded her of her own brokenness. Yet, instead of healing, she hardened, and in that hardness, she lost the ability to love gently. Ethan returned to the living room and sat by the fire. He watched the flames dance, shadows flickering across Rex's face. The dog's ears twitched as if he, too, sensed the tension running beneath the house's quiet. Ethan whispered, "We're losing her, boy, and I don't even know when it started." Rex lifted his head, pressing his nose to Ethan's knee, and for the first time in years, Ethan let his guard down. He ran a trembling hand through the dog's fur and whispered, "Help me fix this." Outside, thunder rolled far away, low and distant. Upstairs, Ellie stirred in her sleep, murmuring a single word that would haunt Ethan for days. "Daddy?" And though no one heard it, in that fragile house filled with unspoken grief, something old began to break, making space for the light that would one day return. The following week in Maple Hollow carried a strange stillness, the kind that made even the birds sound hesitant. The morning fog lingered longer than usual, hanging over the pine-lined roads like breath caught between apologies. Ethan Cole sat in his patrol car outside the elementary school, the engine off, his eyes on the classroom windows. It had been days since the incident in the rain, yet Ellie still avoided his gaze at breakfast, still flinched when Vanessa raised her voice. He'd thought bringing her croissants and warm milk would soften her silence, but she only smiled politely, a smile that didn't reach her eyes, and said, thank you in a whisper, so faint it barely felt like a sound. Today he was here, not as a father, but as a man trying to understand what he had missed. The school had requested a meeting with him. He wasn't sure if that was good or bad. Rex sat in the back seat, his amber eyes fixed on the door, tail still. He didn't bark or whine. He rarely did. He just watched, as if he knew that sometimes silence said more than noise. The bell rang, children spilling into the yard, their laughter echoing against the red brick walls. Ellie emerged last, walking beside a slender woman in her 40s wearing a beige coat and wire-framed glasses. Her name was Rachel Whitmore, the school counselor. She was tall and soft-spoken, with streaks of silver in her dark hair, and an expression that carried both intelligence and weariness. Years of listening to broken stories had carved gentleness into her voice, but also a quiet firmness, the kind that only those who've seen too much pain can possess. Rachel had grown up in foster care, and perhaps because of that, she had dedicated her life to helping children find a voice when adults stopped hearing them. When she saw Ethan, she smiled faintly. "Officer Cole," she greeted. "Thank you for coming." Her tone was warm but deliberate, not friendly enough to comfort, not distant enough to offend. Ellie hesitated, her small hand clutching her backpack strap. "You can go play, sweetheart," Rachel said softly. "I just need a few minutes with your dad." Ellie nodded and walked toward the playground, glancing back once. Rex wagged his tail, and the corner of her mouth lifted in the smallest of smiles before she disappeared behind the slide. Inside Rachel's office, the walls were lined with children's drawings, rainbows, stick figures, houses with smoke rising from chimneys. A jar of colorful marbles sat on her desk, half full, each one representing a child who had completed counseling. The air smelled faintly of mint tea and paper. Ethan sat stiffly in the chair opposite her. "You said there was something important," he began. Rachel folded her hands. "It's about Ellie. Her teachers have noticed changes." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "She's become withdrawn, startles easily, avoids eye contact, and recently she's begun drawing. Things that concern us. Broken dishes, rain, dark rooms." Ethan's throat tightened. "You think someone's hurting her." Rachel's eyes softened. "I think she's afraid of something. Children don't always speak pain directly, but it shows through patterns." She hesitated, then asked, "How's her stepmother?" Ethan's jaw flexed. "Vanessa's strict," he said carefully. "But she's not. She wouldn't." He stopped. Rachel didn't press. "Sometimes harm isn't shouting or hitting," she said gently. "Sometimes it's silence, neglect, isolation." He looked away, guilt heavy on his face. For years he'd buried himself in duty, believing that earning a badge and paying bills made him a good father. But now he realized that responsibility without presence was just another kind of absence. When the meeting ended, Rachel handed him a pamphlet. "If you ever need someone to talk to, for her or for you, come by. My door's open." Ethan nodded, though he doubted he'd use it. He wasn't the kind of man who asked for help. Outside, Rex was waiting by the car, sitting perfectly still despite the cold wind. Ellie ran toward him, dropping to her knees to hug his neck. "Hey, buddy," she whispered, burying her face in his fur. For a brief second, she looked like a child again, not the small, cautious shadow she had become. Ethan watched, something tightening and breaking in him all at once. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Ethan drove home in silence. The town glowed faintly under the amber streetlights. He parked by the curb, his mind replaying Rachel's words. When he stepped inside, Vanessa was arranging flowers on the dining table, lilies, white and flawless, their scent too clean for the air of that house. "You're late," she said without looking up. "Dinner's cold." "I had a meeting at school," Ethan replied, removing his jacket. "With the counselor." Vanessa's hands stilled. "And?" "They're concerned about Ellie." She sighed dramatically, setting down the vase. "Of course they are. That child needs discipline, not therapy. She plays the victim every time someone tells her no." Ethan frowned. "She's 10, Vanessa. She's not playing anything." "She's manipulating you," Vanessa snapped, her calmness cracking for the first time. "She wants attention, and you're falling for it, just like her mother spoiled her." The mention of Laura was a knife twisting in his chest. Don't, he said quietly. Don't bring her into this. Vanessa smiled coldly. Why not? She's the ghost in every corner of this house. Ethan didn't answer. He turned away, walking toward the living room, where Ellie sat cross-legged on the floor, coloring silently. Rex lay beside her, head on his paws, watching Vanessa's every move. When Ethan sat down next to his daughter, she didn't look up. What are you drawing, kiddo? He asked softly. A place, she said without lifting her pencil. It's quiet there. Nobody yells. He swallowed hard. Can I see it? She shook her head. Not yet. It's not finished. Later that night, after everyone had gone to bed, Ethan couldn't sleep. He sat on the porch, a blanket over his shoulders, the sound of rain returning softly in the distance. Rex lay beside him, resting his head on Ethan's boot. The dog's steady breathing matched the rhythm of the rain. You ever think, Ethan murmured, that we're the ones who need saving, not them? Rex's tail thumped once, as if answering yes. From inside the house came the faint sound of crying, muffled, fragile. Ellie. Ethan rose instantly, climbing the stairs quietly. He opened her door to find her sitting upright in bed, clutching Rex's worn tennis ball to her chest. Nightmare? He asked gently. She nodded, tears glistening in the dim light. It's okay, sweetheart, he said, sitting beside her. It was just a dream. She looked at him then, really looked, and whispered, I dreamed I called you, but you didn't pick up. The words hit him harder than any storm. He pulled her into his arms, holding her until her trembling stopped. When she finally fell asleep against his chest, he stayed there long after, staring at the window where rain traced silent rivers down the glass. Downstairs, Vanessa stood in the hallway, unseen, her expression caught somewhere between jealousy and fear. She turned away, her reflection flashing briefly in the mirror, the image of a woman who had built walls so high she'd forgotten how to climb down. The clock struck midnight. In that fragile house of quiet cries, Ethan realized he could no longer pretend that everything was fine. Something had to change, and it would begin with him. Vietnamese report. Kong Ho Chi Tie Trung La Pithay Joy. Chapter 3. Morong Theo Mas Truyen Jon Tom Tat, Tim Hon Vet Moy. Rachel Whitmore, Chuyen Vien Tu Van Hook. Juong Ko Kwa Kutung Song Trung Hi Thong Sham Sok Noi Duong. Leng Guoi Ting Te Va Jong Com. Kach Ting Tiet Fu Fa Trien Them. Boy Gap Go Gua. Ethan Va Rachel. Tem Li Kwa Eli Tai Truong. And Guan Gok Ting Kesh Kwa. Vanessa Juok. Emokwa Mau Tuan. The sky over Maple Hollow that evening was the color of bruised metal, swollen clouds pressing low above the roofs. The rain had paused, but the air still tasted of storm, thick, metallic, waiting. Inside the coal house, the tension was as heavy as the weather outside. Ethan stood by the living room window, looking at the wet streetlights flickering through the mist. His badge lay on the table beside his gun, both symbols of order that suddenly felt meaningless. Upstairs, he could hear Ellie's faint laughter, the first in weeks, as she read aloud to Noah from a worn picture book. The sound should have brought peace, but it only reminded him how fragile that peace was. Vanessa entered from the kitchen, a glass of red wine in hand. Her movements were precise, like a dancer hitting marks on a stage. Tonight she wore a gray silk blouse and black trousers, elegant but sharp, her hair pinned back so tightly it seemed to pull the tension straight into her eyes. You're quiet again, she said, her voice smooth but edged. You used to talk more before you started believing everyone's against you. Ethan didn't turn. I'm thinking, he said simply. That's what you always say before you decide something ridiculous, she replied, setting the glass down with a soft clink. I saw the school counselor's number on your phone. Still pretending she understands this family better than I do? She's helping Ellie, he said, still facing the window. Something you should want too. Vanessa laughed softly, the sound brittle. Helping her? By filling her head with nonsense? That woman's entire career is built on making parents feel guilty. Ethan turned then, his voice steady. You think guilt is something people give you. It's not. It's what's left when you finally start listening. Vanessa's expression flickered, then hardened. So that's what this is now? You blaming me because your daughter's a fragile little thing who can't handle discipline? Before Ethan could answer, a soft knock came from the stairs. Ellie stood there in her pajamas, holding Noah's hand. "Dad," she said, her voice small, "we're thirsty." Ethan smiled gently. "Go on, I'll bring you water." Vanessa's eyes followed the children as they disappeared into the kitchen. "You see," she whispered sharply. "Even now she interrupts adult conversations. She knows you'll rush to her the moment she opens her mouth." "She's a child," Ethan said. "That's what children do." "No," Vanessa hissed, her calm cracking. "That's what manipulative children do." She grabbed his arm. "You don't see it, do you? She's trying to replace me." Ethan stepped back, his voice dropping low. "No one asked you to compete with a 10-year-old. The silence that followed was deep and dangerous. Outside, the wind picked up again, brushing against the windows like restless hands. Rex, lying near the doorway, lifted his head, ears twitching. His body tensed as if he sensed a shift in the air. Vanessa's face flushed with anger. "You think you're some kind of hero? Because you wear that badge, because that mutt worships you, and your daughter looks at you like you're God. But you're not. You're a coward hiding behind your uniform." Ethan's jaw tightened, but he didn't raise his voice. "I've made mistakes, but at least I admit them." She took a step closer, eyes glinting. "And what about me? Do you ever ask why I am the way I am?" He met her gaze. "Maybe you should start asking yourself that." Her hand shot out, knocking the wineglass from the table. It shattered against the hardwood, crimson spreading like blood across the floor. Upstairs, Ellie gasped at the sound. Rex barked once, deep and sharp, leaping to his feet. Ethan raised a hand instinctively, signaling him to stay, but the dog's eyes were locked on Vanessa, steady, unblinking. "You're scaring the kids," Ethan said quietly. Vanessa's voice rose, trembling with fury. "I'm scaring them? I'm the only one trying to teach them how to survive. You think the world will be kind to them? You think love will protect them?" Her voice cracked then, something raw breaking through the anger. "It didn't protect me." For a heartbeat, Ethan saw something in her eyes. Fear, maybe grief. But it vanished as quickly as it came. Ellie appeared again at the top of the stairs, clutching Noah. "Dad," she whispered. Ethan turned toward her, his tone soft. "It's okay, sweetheart. Go back upstairs." But Vanessa shouted, "Don't tell her it's okay. It's never okay when people break things and expect forgiveness." Her words echoed through the house. Rex barked again, stepping forward between Ellie and the stairs, his body a tense wall of muscle and instinct. Ethan moved fast, placing himself between the dog and Vanessa. "Enough!" he shouted. "This ends tonight." The room went still except for the ticking of the wall clock. Vanessa's chest rose and fell rapidly. Her hands trembled. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice hoarse. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, with a calmness that scared even himself, "Pack your things. We're leaving." Vanessa blinked. "We?" "I'm taking the kids," he said. "You can stay here. I won't fight you, but I won't let you hurt them anymore." For a moment she looked stunned, then laughed, a small, broken laugh that didn't sound human. "You'll regret this," she whispered. "You can't save them. You can't even save yourself." Ethan didn't answer. He turned and knelt beside Rex, resting a hand on the dog's neck. "Get the bags, boy," he murmured, the old command from their years in service, a trick Rex still remembered. The dog trotted off to the hallway where Ethan's duffel bag hung on a hook, tugging it loose with his teeth. Ellie and Noah came down quietly, tears shining in their eyes, but relief trembling beneath them. Ethan helped them into their coats, his movements steady, almost ritualistic. Vanessa didn't move. She just stood there, staring at the three of them as if trying to memorize what loss looked like. When Ethan opened the front door, the cold night air rushed in, smelling of wet pine and freedom. He turned once more to face her. "Goodbye, Vanessa." She didn't reply. She only whispered something too low to hear, the words dissolving into the sound of wind. Outside, the rain started again, soft and relentless. Rex led the way to the car, his limp barely noticeable as he trotted ahead. Ellie climbed in, clutching Noah close, while Ethan checked the back seat twice, an old habit from years on duty. When he started the engine, headlights cut through the dark like a path drawn by resolve. As they pulled away, Ellie looked back through the window. Vanessa stood on the porch light flickering above her, one hand raised slightly as if she wanted to call them back, but no longer remembered how to speak love. The house behind her glowed pale, cold, and empty. They drove in silence for miles, the only sound the steady rhythm of the windshield wipers and Rex's soft breathing from the back seat. Maple Hollow faded behind them, replaced by the vast quiet of the forest road leading toward Pinevale Lake, the cabin Ethan hadn't visited in years, a relic from his father's time. Halfway there, Ellie broke the silence. "Dad," she said softly, "are we running away?" Ethan glanced at her reflection in the rearview mirror, her eyes wide and uncertain. "No," he said gently. "We're going home." Rex turned his head at the word home, his tail thumping once against the seat. And in that moment, for the first time in years, Ethan believed it might be true. The car disappeared into the rain, its taillights two small embers fading into the dark. The morning after they left Maple Hollow, the world seemed washed clean. Mist clung to the road as Ethan's old Ford truck climbed the narrow path toward Pinevale Lake, a place so hidden it didn't appear on most maps. The forest on either side was a cathedral of pines, their trunks rising tall and silent, branches dripping with dew. The air smelled of moss, wet earth, and something else Ethan hadn't felt in years: peace. Ellie sat in the back seat, cradling Noah against her shoulder. Both were asleep, their faces pale but calm after a long night. Rex sat beside them, his head resting on the window frame, watching the passing trees with the alert stillness of a guardian who didn't trust silence yet. The faint scar above his left eye, an old wound from his K-9 days, caught the gray light and glinted like a medal. He was older now, his muzzle touched with silver, but his presence filled the car with a kind of steady reassurance. Ethan turned onto a dirt road that wound through thick ferns and wildflowers, then finally stopped before a weathered cabin overlooking the lake. The cabin was small, built from cedar logs decades ago by his late father, once a park ranger known for his quiet dignity and his belief that a man's peace depends on where he stands when the world falls apart. Ethan hadn't been here since before Laura died. The sight of it, the slanted porch, the old wind chime tangled in cobwebs, brought a wave of memory so strong he had to grip the wheel. "Where are we?" Ellie asked softly, rubbing her eyes. "Our new home," Ethan said. "At least for now." She looked around uncertainly. "It's quiet." "That's the point," he replied, forcing a small smile. They stepped out into the crisp air. The lake spread out before them like a sheet of gray glass, reflecting the pale morning sky. The forest whispered around them, ravens calling from the treetops, the faint rustle of wind through pine needles. Rex immediately began sniffing the ground, tail wagging slowly, exploring the territory with the curiosity of someone who'd seen too many cities and not enough open skies. Inside, the cabin smelled of cedar, dust, and old firewood. There was one main room with a stone fireplace, two small bedrooms, and a tiny kitchen where sunlight fell through a cracked window. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Ethan got to work, lighting the stove and unpacking boxes. Ellie helped quietly, folding blankets and wiping the counters. Noah toddled around dragging a wooden spoon he'd found, banging it against the wall with delight. For the first time in days, Ethan laughed. Just a small sound, but it felt strange and good in his chest. By noon, smoke curled lazily from the chimney. Ethan made scrambled eggs that were too salty and toast that was slightly burnt, but the children ate every bite. "Best breakfast ever," Ellie said softly. Her tone was shy, as if she didn't quite believe. She was allowed to compliment him. Ethan smiled. "You're a terrible liar, but I'll take it." After breakfast, they walked down to the lake. The water was cold and clear, and when the clouds parted briefly, sunlight broke through like grace. Ethan skipped a flat stone across the surface. It bounced 3 times before sinking. Ellie tried and failed, then laughed, a sound that startled him with its brightness. Rex barked once, his tail swishing as if approving the moment. They stayed there until the wind turned sharp. On the way back to the cabin, they found an old mailbox half buried in weeds. The nameplate read, "Coal," letters faded by time. Inside was only dust and a single yellowed envelope. An old letter from Ethan's father, written years ago but never mailed. The handwriting was steady, the ink faintly smudged. If you ever return here, son, remember, this place was built not to hide from the world, but to listen to it again. You'll know what that means when silence stops scaring you. Ethan folded the letter carefully and slipped it into his pocket. The words lingered in his mind long after they returned inside. Later, while unpacking, Ellie found a small wooden box on one of the shelves. It had once stored fishing lures, but the hinges were still strong. "Can I have this?" she asked. "Sure," Ethan said, distractedly sorting through old tools. That night, after dinner, Ethan found the box sitting in the middle of the kitchen table. On top of it lay a folded note written in Ellie's small, neat handwriting. "Dad, don't forget to eat breakfast tomorrow." He stared at the paper for a long time, then laughed quietly, a soft, broken sound that turned into something warm. He grabbed a pen and wrote back, "Thanks, sweetheart. I'll make pancakes next time. Sleep well." He placed his reply inside the box and closed the lid. Rex lay curled by the fireplace, his fur gleaming in the firelight, eyes half closed. He thumped his tail twice when Ethan sat down beside him. "Looks like we've got a new rule, boy," Ethan murmured. "No secrets, just letters." The next morning, another note appeared. "Pancakes sound nice." From that day on, the box became their way of speaking. Some days the notes were simple. "Good luck at work. The lake looks happy today." Other times they were deeper. "I get scared at night. I miss Mom sometimes." Ethan answered each one. The box soon filled with folded paper and inked hearts. It wasn't much, but it was a bridge, and for the first time since Laura's death, Ethan felt like he was building something that mattered. Days passed in gentle rhythm. Ethan worked on repairing the fence and fixing the cabin roof, while Ellie and Noah explored the woods with Rex at their side. Once they discovered a narrow trail leading to an old wooden dock, half collapsed into the water. Ellie crouched at the edge, tossing breadcrumbs to the fish, and said, "Do you think Mom would like it here?" Ethan sat beside her, watching the ripples spread. "She would have loved it," he said. "She always liked quiet places." Ellie nodded. "Me too. Quiet doesn't feel scary anymore." Rex barked once as if in agreement, then waded into the shallow water to retrieve a floating stick, shaking himself dry all over Ethan's jeans. Ellie laughed, the sound echoing across the lake. That evening, as twilight spread over Pineville, Ethan stood by the window, watching the children draw near the fireplace. Rex lay beside them, occasionally lifting his head when Noah's crayon rolled too far. The lake glimmered faintly beyond the trees, the air carrying the scent of pine and smoke. For the first time in years, Ethan didn't feel like a man running from something. He felt like someone finally standing still long enough to see what was left. Up on the mantel, the wooden box sat in its place of honor. That night, when Ethan opened it, there was a new note inside, written in Ellie's careful hand. "I like this place, Dad. Nobody yells here." He swallowed hard, writing back only 2 words. "Me too." Rex shifted beside him, resting his muzzle on Ethan's knee. The fire crackled softly, and the night outside was full of the kind of silence that didn't hurt anymore. In that quiet cabin by the lake, a broken family began to mend, not through grand gestures or words, but through the gentle rhythm of living and listening again. And though Ethan didn't know it yet, that small wooden box would become the heart of their new life, the thing that would teach them how to speak again. The first snow came early that year. Pineville Lake lay under a veil of white, the water frozen at the edges like glass turned solid. Smoke rose from the chimney of the old cabin, and inside, warmth flickered against the wood-paneled walls. Life had begun to settle into rhythm, morning walks with Rex, breakfast by the fire, and quiet evenings spent writing notes for the kitchen box. Yet, even in peace, some silences carried shadows. One cold morning, Ethan noticed Rex limping worse than usual. The dog had always hidden pain well, but today his movements were strained, each step careful. "Hey, boy," Ethan murmured, kneeling to examine him. The old wound from the warehouse explosion years ago had begun to swell again. "We'll get you checked out," he promised, scratching behind his ears. Rex licked his hand once, trusting as always. The nearest veterinary clinic was 20 miles away, in the small town of Cedar Glen. The drive wound through pine forests and narrow roads flanked by old barns and frozen streams. When they arrived, the bell over the clinic door chimed softly. The waiting room smelled faintly of antiseptic and cedar shavings. Behind the counter stood a woman Ethan had never seen before. Grace Whitmore, mid-30s, tall and slender, with auburn hair tucked into a loose braid. Her face was the kind that caught light easily. Freckled, open, kind, but her eyes held the quiet fatigue of someone who had seen too much loss and refused to let it make her hard. She wore a faded gray sweater under her lab coat, sleeves rolled up to the elbows, and a silver bracelet that jingled when she moved. "Morning," she greeted, her voice low and calm. "What can we do for you and your friend?" Ethan explained Rex's limp. Grace crouched beside the dog, her movements slow and deliberate. Rex sniffed her hand, then rested his head against her knee, a rare gesture of immediate trust. "Well," she said softly, "that's a good sign. He doesn't do that for everyone." "He's picky with people," Ethan said with a faint smile. "Smart dog," Grace replied, examining the leg gently. "Old injury, right?" "Yeah, from service. He saved my life once," Ethan said. Grace looked up at him, her expression softening. "Then, we'll make sure he's comfortable. Heroes deserve that much." While Grace treated Rex, Ethan noticed a small poster on the wall. Pathlight Haven, Animal Rescue and Emotional Support Center. The image showed children playing with dogs in an open field. When Grace caught him looking, she said, "That's our little side project. We pair rescued animals with kids who've been through trauma. Helps both of them heal faster." Ethan nodded slowly. "That's something I wish I'd known years ago." Grace smiled, not out of pity but recognition. "You've got that look," she said gently. "The kind of man who carries too much silence." He didn't answer. Instead, he watched Rex, who now rested comfortably, tail tapping softly against the floor. After finishing, Grace handed him a prescription and said, "He'll be fine, but he needs rest and mild exercise. Bring him back in 2 weeks." Then, as Ethan prepared to leave, she added, "If you ever want to bring the kids by Pathlight, we could use help socializing the animals. It's good for them, and for people too." Ethan hesitated but nodded. "I'll think about it." That afternoon, back at the cabin, Ellie greeted Rex with tears of relief. "You're okay," she whispered, wrapping her arms around his neck. Rex pressed his muzzle against her cheek, tail wagging. Ethan handed her a pamphlet. "The vet said there's a place where kids can help take care of animals. Thought you might like that." Ellie studied the picture. "They look happy," she said softly. "Can we go?" "Sure," Ethan said. "Maybe tomorrow." The next day they drove to Pathlight Haven. The center sat on a hill overlooking Cedar Glen, surrounded by white fences and open fields. Snow sparkled under the winter sun. A wooden sign at the entrance read, "Pathlight Haven, where second chances begin." Children were playing with dogs in the yard, laughter carrying through the crisp air. A few adults in volunteer vests supervised, tossing tennis balls and handing out treats. Grace stood near the barn, her hair glowing copper under the light. When she saw them, her smile warmed the cold morning. "You made it," she said. "This is Ellie, and that's Noah," Ethan introduced. Grace knelt to greet them. "Hey there," she said softly. "We've got plenty of four-legged friends who'd love some company." Ellie hesitated at first, but Rex nudged her forward with his nose. Grace led them to a small pen, where a timid golden retriever sat curled in the corner. "This is Daisy," she explained. "She's shy, but kind. She came from a bad situation, too." Ellie crouched beside the dog, holding out her hand. Daisy sniffed cautiously, then licked her fingers. "She's scared," Ellie whispered. Grace nodded. "Sometimes being scared just means you remember too much. But if you're gentle, she'll remember that people can be good too." Ethan watched from a distance, something tightening in his chest. Ellie's face softened, her hand steady as she stroked Daisy's fur. Rex sat beside her, calm and regal, as if giving silent permission. For the first time since leaving Maple Hollow, Ethan saw real light in his daughter's eyes. Over the following weeks, they returned often. Ellie grew close to Grace, who taught her how to groom the dogs, feed them, and read their moods. Grace had a way of explaining things that made difficult truths sound simple. "Animals don't judge," she told Ellie one afternoon as they brushed Daisy. They just listen. Sometimes that's all we need. Ethan began, volunteering too, repairing fences and shoveling snow from the walkways. Grace often joined him during breaks, her thermos of coffee steaming in the cold. They talked about small things, the weather, the lake, Rex's stubbornness, but beneath the words was a quiet understanding. Both had known loss. Both had chosen to keep moving. One evening, as the sun sank behind the hills, Grace mentioned something that lingered in Ethan's mind. "You know," she said, her breath misting in the air, "healing isn't about forgetting what broke you. It's about learning to live without bleeding every time you remember." Ethan looked at her, snowflakes catching in his hair. "You sound like someone who learned that the hard way." Grace smiled faintly. "Maybe I did." She glanced at the horizon, her expression distant. "My husband was a firefighter. Died in a blaze 5 years ago. I tried to go back to normal, but the world doesn't go back. It just shifts. You learn to walk in the new shape of it." He didn't say anything, but his eyes softened. They stood in silence as Rex and Daisy played nearby, their footprints marking the snow in loops and circles. Later that night, back at the cabin, Ethan found a new note in the kitchen box. Ellie had written, "Miss Grace said even broken hearts can still love. Is that true?" He wrote back, "Yes, especially those." He left the note in the box, then turned toward the window where snow fell quietly outside. Rex lay near the fire, sighing in his sleep. The cabin was warm, filled with a peace that no longer felt fragile. Somewhere deep inside, Ethan realized that what had started as escape was slowly turning into something else, a return. Snow continued to fall over Pineville Lake, transforming the cabin and its surroundings into a quiet world of white and silver. The lake had frozen at the edges, and the air smelled of pine and smoke. Winter days blended softly into one another, but inside the small cabin, something was slowly changing. The kitchen box, once a simple wooden container, had become a vessel of trust, filling daily with folded pieces of paper that told the story of a family learning how to speak again. Each morning, Ethan would find a note waiting for him beside the coffee pot. Sometimes Ellie's handwriting was neat and patient. Other times hurried and full of tiny smudges, like thoughts that couldn't wait to be said. Rex followed me to the lake again. He barked at his reflection. Or, "Grace said Daisy smiled when I brushed her today." Small things, but precious. Ethan kept every note, even the silly ones, in an old cigar tin his father once owned. To him, it was more valuable than any medal. Rex had grown livelier since his last visit to Grace's clinic. The swelling on his leg had gone down, though a faint limp remained, a reminder of all the lives he had saved. He spent his days patrolling the cabin's edge, chasing off squirrels, and watching over Ellie and Noah when they played in the snow. Daisy often joined them now. Grace had gently suggested that Ethan foster her for a while, to help her adjust. The golden retriever's shy demeanor had begun to fade, her fur glinting like honey in the pale sunlight. The cabin had never felt more alive, laughter mixed with barking, and sometimes the walls seemed to hum with a quiet rhythm, a heartbeat of belonging. But beneath that peace, Ethan knew there were still things unsaid, ghosts that lingered in the corners of memory. One evening, while Ellie helped Noah build a snow fort outside, Ethan sat at the table reading the day's letters. Ellie had written, "Grace says people talk better when they write because words don't interrupt each other." He smiled faintly and replied, "She's right. Sometimes writing helps us listen to ourselves too." He folded the note and placed it back in the box. When the children came in, cheeks flushed from the cold, Grace arrived soon after with Daisy trotting at her heels. She carried a wicker basket filled with bread, jam, and cocoa powder. "Peace offerings," she said with a grin. "I can't have the kids thinking I'm only good for vaccinations." Ethan chuckled. "They already think you're a magician." Grace laughed softly, setting the basket down. Her laughter was a strange mix of joy and restraint, as if she still wasn't used to letting it out fully. Her eyes swept across the room, pausing at the wooden box on the table. "Still writing letters?" she asked. "Every day," Ethan said. "Ellie writes, I answer. It's become our way of talking." Grace's smile deepened, but there was something wistful in it. "When I was a kid," she said, "my dad used to leave notes under my pillow when he went on long shifts. He was a paramedic. said it was his way of staying close, even when he couldn't be. She fell quiet for a moment, eyes distant. He died when I was 16. I kept the notes until they fell apart. Ethan looked at her gently. Maybe that's why you do what you do now. Help people hold on to things that don't fall apart so easily. Grace blinked, smiling faintly. Maybe, she said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Dinner that night was simple: grilled bread, soup, and laughter. Grace stayed later than usual, helping Ellie wash dishes while Noah curled up beside Rex and Daisy by the fire. When it was time to leave, she paused by the door, glancing at the lake beyond the frosted window. The sky's clearing, she said softly. You can see the stars again. Stay a little longer, Ethan said, before he could stop himself. Grace hesitated, then smiled. If I do, I'll never leave. Her words lingered long after she'd gone, floating like snowflakes that refused to melt. That night, as the children slept, Ethan sat by the fire with Rex lying beside him. The flames cast slow-moving shadows across the floor. He opened the kitchen box one more time. Inside was a new note, not from Ellie, but from Grace. The handwriting was elegant, looping slightly. Thank you for reminding me what quiet kindness feels like. Ethan stared at the paper for a long time. He didn't write back, not yet. Instead, he placed the note on the mantel beside his father's old compass, where the firelight made it shimmer like a promise. Days passed, and the rhythm of life continued. Snowstorms came and went, the world outside changing shape, but the warmth within the cabin remaining constant. On one of those evenings, Ethan decided to bring the kids back to Pathlight Haven. Grace greeted them with her usual easy smile, cheeks pink from the cold. The shelter was busier now, volunteers preparing for a charity adoption event. Among them was a man Ethan hadn't met before. Ethan, this is Mark, Grace introduced. He's our coordinator. He runs the adoption program. Mark was in his 40s, short and broad-shouldered, with sandy hair and kind eyes that seemed to carry both warmth and fatigue. He shook Ethan's hand firmly. Grace told me about your K9, he said. Fine-looking dog? He used to serve? Yeah, retired now, Ethan said. Rex looks like he could train the rookies, Mark joked. We could use that kind of discipline around here. Ethan smiled politely, though he sensed a quiet familiarity between Mark and Grace. Professional, but close. He didn't know why it bothered him, but it did. Grace noticed his silence and quickly shifted the topic. Ellie, she said, how about you help me set up the photo board? As they worked, Grace knelt beside Ellie, helping her hang pictures of rescued dogs who had found homes. Every face here has a story, Grace said. Even the sad ones end up teaching us something about hope. Ethan watched them, the image of the two, Grace's calm presence beside Ellie's newfound laughter, making something inside him ache in a way that wasn't painful, just deeply human. He realized then that Grace wasn't just helping his daughter heal, she was helping him remember how to live. Later that night, back at the cabin, Ethan wrote a note of his own for the box. Sometimes, people don't rescue dogs. Dogs rescue people. Maybe it's the same with people too. The next morning, he found Ellie's reply waiting for him. I think Grace rescued you, Dad. He laughed softly, tucking the note into the cigar tin. Maybe she did, he whispered, glancing at Rex, who wagged his tail knowingly. The days grew longer, the sun rising earlier each morning. Ethan began noticing small changes, Ellie humming while she cooked, Noah trying to write his own tiny notes with clumsy letters, Grace stopping by more often with stories or leftover bread. Life wasn't perfect, but it was real, and that was enough. One evening, Grace brought over an envelope sealed with wax. We're hosting a small gathering at the shelter, she said. Music, food, maybe a few stories from the volunteers. You and the kids should come. Ethan took the envelope. We'll be there. After she left, he stood for a long time on the porch, looking at the lake bathed in moonlight. The dogs rested by his feet. Rex, steadfast and loyal, Daisy, gentle and golden. Inside, the kitchen box waited on the table, glowing softly in the firelight. He added a final note for the day. Some letters change the way we breathe. When he closed the lid, he didn't realize that Ellie had written hers just minutes before. Inside, waiting for him to find it in the morning, was a message that read, I think we're home now. And for the first time, Ethan believed it completely. The snow had begun to thaw when the night of the Pathlight Haven gathering arrived. The forest around Cedar Glen glowed under a pale winter moon, the air crisp but kind. The small rescue center had been transformed. Strings of soft lights hung across the fences, and paper lanterns bobbed gently in the evening wind. Music drifted from a small speaker near the barn, the tune faint and warm, like a memory that refused to fade. Ethan parked his truck near the entrance. Ellie sat beside him, wearing a wool hat too large for her head, her excitement barely contained. Noah, bundled in his puffy jacket, clutched Rex's leash with both hands, while Daisy's tail wagged so hard it thumped against the door. For a moment, Ethan just sat there, watching them. The glow from the lanterns reflected in Ellie's eyes, and he thought of how far they'd come, from the night she cried over a shattered bowl to this quiet peace. "Ready?" he asked. "More than ready," Ellie said. When they entered the yard, laughter and conversation filled the air. Volunteers mingled with families, children ran with dogs weaving between them, and the smell of roasted corn and cocoa mixed with wood smoke. The sight made Ethan's chest ache, not with sadness, but gratitude. He hadn't realized how much the world could soften when kindness gathered in one place. Grace spotted them near the refreshment table. She wore a dark green coat that matched her eyes, her auburn hair loose around her shoulders. There was a small smudge of flour on her cheek, proof she'd been baking again. "You made it," she said, her smile as warm as the lantern light. "Wouldn't miss it," Ethan replied. "You've outdone yourself." Grace laughed softly. "It wasn't just me. The kids baked half the cookies." Ellie beamed. "Grace taught me how to make the chocolate ones." "Well," Grace said, mock whispering, "I may have burned the first batch." They laughed together, and something easy passed between them, like a thread of light connecting two people who no longer needed to explain their scars. The evening continued with gentle chaos. Music played, people danced in the snow, and the dogs, Rex, Daisy, and half a dozen others, became part of the celebration. Rex, though older, still moved with purpose, his gaze sharp and protective. Daisy followed close behind him, cautious but content. At one point, Noah tripped near the fire pit, and before Ethan could react, Rex was already there, nudging the boy up with his nose. The crowd clapped, amused, and Grace knelt to pat Rex's head. "Still the hero," she said softly. "Always," Ethan replied. Later in the evening, Mark, the center's coordinator, took the small wooden stage near the barn. He wore his usual flannel shirt and windbreaker, his cheeks flushed from the cold. "Before we end tonight," he said, "I'd like to share a few words, and maybe ask one of our new friends to say something too." He looked toward Ethan with a half smile. "Officer Cole, you mind coming up here?" Ethan froze. The crowd turned toward him, expectant but kind. Grace gave a small nod of encouragement. Ellie tugged at his sleeve. "You can do it, Dad," she whispered. He walked up slowly, his boots crunching in the snow. The lights seemed brighter on the small stage, the night quieter than before. He looked out over the crowd, faces he barely knew, yet somehow trusted. "I'm not much of a speaker," he began, his voice steady but low. "But I guess I've learned a few things lately." He glanced down at Rex, sitting by his feet, and then at Ellie, whose hands were clasped under her chin. "For a long time, I thought being a good father meant working hard, keeping things under control. But sometimes, control is just another word for fear. I let silence do my talking, and silence can break more than words ever could." A few heads nodded in the crowd. Grace's eyes glistened faintly. "This dog," Ethan continued, resting a hand on Rex's back, "has been my partner for 8 years. He's saved lives, mine included. But maybe what he really saved wasn't a man. It was a family. Because he reminded us how to listen, how to protect, how to forgive." The night was still. Even the wind seemed to pause. "I used to think rescue meant pulling someone out of danger. But now I know it's more than that. It's sitting with someone in the dark until they find their own way back to the light." He stopped, unsure how to finish. Grace, standing near the front, whispered softly, "You already did." The crowd erupted in gentle applause, warm, not loud. When Ethan stepped down, Ellie ran into his arms, her face buried in his coat. "You were amazing," she said. "Couldn't have done it without you," he replied, kissing the top of her head. Grace walked over, her eyes soft. "You said what everyone here needed to hear," she murmured, "especially me." They stood close for a moment, the music swelling again around them. Then, from the corner of the yard, Mark raised a mug. "To second chances!" he called. Everyone echoed the toast. "To second chances!" As the night deepened, the crowd began to thin. Lanterns flickered lower, and laughter softened into murmurs. Grace found Ethan by the fence, both watching the frozen lake glimmer under the moonlight. "You know," she said quietly, "I think your words tonight might have helped more people than you realize." "I wasn't trying to," he said with a faint smile. "That's why they mattered," she replied. Rex nudged Grace's hand, and she bent to scratch his ear. "I think he approves too," she said. "Rex doesn't approve of many," Ethan joked. "You're in rare company." She laughed softly, brushing snow from his sleeve. "Maybe it's because I bring cookies." They stood there a while, side by side, the cold air between them turning into something almost tender. When Grace finally turned to leave, she paused. "Hey, Ethan," she said, "next week, Pathlight's hosting a class, therapy training for rescue dogs. You and Rex should join." "Therapy dogs?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "Yeah," she said with a grin. "He's already halfway there, and I think it might be good for you too." He chuckled. "You're probably right." "Of course I am," she said, winking before walking toward her car. As her taillights disappeared down the snowy road, Ethan stood quietly, his breath rising like smoke into the cold air. Rex leaned against his leg, and for once, Ethan didn't feel alone in the silence. Later that night, back at the cabin, he found a new note in the kitchen box. Ellie had written it before bed. "You were brave tonight, Dad. Mom would have been proud." He wrote back, "I think she'd be proud of you too." When he closed the box, Rex lifted his head from the rug, giving a soft, contented sigh. Outside, the wind moved through the pines with a sound like whispered prayers. For the first time, Ethan didn't feel like a man trying to rebuild something lost. He felt like a man who had found something worth protecting again. And somewhere in that quiet night, hope, small but steady, took root and stayed. Spring arrived in Pineville quietly. The snow melted into rivers that whispered through the woods, and the scent of pine needles returned to the air. Morning sunlight painted long, gold streaks across the lake, glimmering on the surface like ripples of glass. The cabin, once a refuge for escape, had become a living thing, a place where laughter replaced silence, and every breath carried peace. Ethan stood on the porch, a cup of black coffee in his hands, watching Rex chase Noah along the path by the water. Daisy followed close behind, tail wagging wildly, while Ellie sat on the steps sketching the scene in her notebook. Her hair caught the light like threads of honey. Inside, the kitchen box sat where it always did, centered on the table, its wooden surface covered in faint scratches and crayon marks. It had once been a tool for survival, for saying what couldn't be spoken aloud. Now, it had become something softer, a ritual, a habit of love. Ethan opened it every morning out of instinct, sometimes finding drawings of dogs, sometimes just small messages like, "Good morning," or "Don't burn the pancakes again." That morning, though, it was empty, and for the first time in months, that felt right. Later that day, Ethan and Rex drove into Cedar Glen for the first day of the therapy training program Grace had invited them to join. The small training center stood at the edge of town, a low building with a red roof and a wide field behind it. A new instructor, Clara Bennett, waited by the entrance, clipboard in hand. Clara was in her 50s, short with curly silver hair and bright green eyes that gleamed with both kindness and command. She wore a weathered denim jacket with patches of different shelters stitched onto the sleeves, a quilt of her decades working with animals and people alike. "You must be Officer Cole," she said, shaking Ethan's hand with surprising strength. "And this fine fellow must be Rex." "That's right," Ethan said, smiling. "He's a little older, but still sharp." Clara crouched to meet Rex's gaze. "Older dogs make the best healers," she said softly. "They know patience and pain." Rex tilted his head as if understanding every word, tail sweeping the ground once in acknowledgement. Inside the center, Grace was already there, unpacking first aid kits and therapy harnesses. She waved when she saw them, her face lighting up in that effortless way that always disarmed him. "I was hoping you wouldn't chicken out," she teased. "Rex made me come," Ethan replied. "He's very persuasive." Grace laughed, the sound mingling with the distant barking of dogs. "Then let's make sure he graduates with honors." The training was slow, but deeply human. Ethan learned how therapy dogs were used in hospitals and trauma centers, how a calm touch could slow a heartbeat, how a steady gaze could quiet a panic attack. Rex excelled in every exercise, sitting still, while a volunteer sobbed, resting his paw gently on a trembling hand, standing guard beside a wheelchair as if it were sacred ground. The instructors praised him often, calling him the old soul. Ethan watched with quiet pride, realizing that his partner wasn't just protecting anymore, he was healing. Meanwhile, Ellie spent her afternoons at Pathlight Haven, helping Grace teach younger volunteers how to feed and groom the animals. Noah followed her everywhere, carrying treats too big for his pockets, his laughter filling the air like sunlight through clouds. Daisy, now fully recovered, had become his constant shadow. Grace sometimes joined them at the lake afterward, where the children skipped stones and Ethan grilled vegetables on a small fire pit. It wasn't a family anyone had planned, but it was one that had found itself anyway. One evening, as twilight spread over the trees, Grace brought a small, leather-bound journal to the cabin. "I've been meaning to give you this," she said. "It's for the notes from the box. I thought maybe you'd want to keep them somewhere safe." Ethan turned the journal over in his hands. The cover was embossed with a single word, home. He looked up, his eyes meeting hers. "You didn't have to." "I wanted to," she said quietly. "Those letters, they're pieces of your story, and maybe someday Ellie will read them and know what healing looks like." He smiled, emotion tightening his throat. "You always know what to say." "Not always," she admitted. "Sometimes I just listen until the words show up." They sat together by the fire that night, reading through a few of the old notes. Ellie's early handwriting wobbled across the paper, sentences full of innocence and hope. Grace read one aloud, laughing softly. "Dad burned the eggs again, but we still ate them." Ethan chuckled. "That was a rough morning." "Looks like you've come a long way," she said, her voice low, sincere. He looked at her for a moment, then said softly, "We both have." Rex lifted his head then, sensing something unspoken between them. Grace reached out, her fingers brushing his fur, then rested her hand against Ethan's for just a moment. The gesture was quiet, but steady, like a promise neither of them needed to say aloud. The following week, the training program concluded with a small ceremony. Clara stood at the front of the room, holding a row of certificates. "Every partnership here represents something extraordinary," she said. "Not perfection, but persistence. Healing doesn't come easy. It takes trust." She looked at Ethan and Rex. "And this team reminds us what trust looks like." The room applauded softly as Ethan accepted Rex's certificate. On it, beneath the printed words, Clara had handwritten a single line. "The dog teaches the man to forgive." He blinked hard, hiding the emotion behind a smile. That evening, back at the cabin, the family celebrated with cocoa and bread Grace had baked. Ellie taped the certificate above the fireplace beside her sketches. "Now Rex is officially a hero again," she said proudly. "Always was," Ethan replied. "Now it's just official." As the fire crackled, Grace pulled a folded note from her coat pocket. "Ellie gave me this earlier," she said, handing it to him. It was written in Ellie's neatest handwriting. "Dad, I think the box is full now. Maybe we don't need to write anymore, because we talk every day. But can we keep it on the table, just in case?" Ethan smiled, his eyes soft. "She's right," he murmured. "We don't need it anymore." Grace placed her hand gently on his arm. "Maybe that's what healing means, not forgetting where you've been, just not needing to go back there every day." Outside, the wind rustled through the pine trees, carrying with it the scent of spring and smoke. Rex and Daisy dozed side by side near the fire, their bodies forming a quiet symmetry of peace. Ellie leaned against Grace, half asleep, while Noah clutched his toy truck, murmuring softly in dreams. Ethan rose, opening the kitchen box one final time. He placed one last note inside, written carefully in his steady hand. "We're finally home." Then he closed the lid. The light from the fireplace glowed across their faces, the family that had once been broken now, whole again, their lives stitched together by kindness, courage, and the small miracles that come when people choose to stay. And beneath the tall pine trees of Pinevale, where silence had once been heavy and cruel, there was only laughter, soft as the wind, carrying forward into tomorrow. In the quiet town of Pinevale, God's hand worked not through thunder or miracles in the sky, but through small acts of love, a father learning to listen, a child learning to forgive, a dog teaching them both what loyalty truly means. Sometimes, the greatest miracles don't arrive with light from heaven. They come softly, through the people and creatures God places in our path. Every broken heart can be healed when we let His grace in. Every silence can turn into song when we choose love over fear. And every home, no matter how lost, can find its way back to the light when we remember that God never stopped knocking on the door. If this story touched your heart, share it so that others may feel the same warmth. Comment Amen if you believe that God still works His miracles in our everyday lives. Subscribe and stay with us. And may the Lord bless you and your loved ones with peace, strength, and a heart that always finds its way home.